Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and today our show is going to feature Bobbie Jethwa, CEO of UK Property Agents, and Zee Razaq, CEO of Surtax St Albans, property industry tax experts. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Hi, Stephen.
Now, we'll get straight on with the questioning, and Bobbie, you're going to go first. In the panel's experience, could they recommend how a landlord best handles maintenance and repairs to properties and the best procedures for emergency situations? And I'm presuming that's a sort of question that's come up because we see a lot of these adverts on the TV now about insurance companies handling maintenance and that sort of thing. Or,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think, you definitely want to give it to a professional company to do your maintenance, and you need to factor that cost within your buy-to-let. Definitely get a professional company in. Emergency-wise, you need to put notices up and give the right contact details for an emergency contact, that if there is a leak or a ceiling's fallen down or something like this, or you can smell gas or whatever. So then, you've got the procedures and the people that you need to contact in place within the rental property as a notice on.
How would you advise your clients to do that? Would it be something that you attach as an addendum to a lease, or
Absolutely,
separate?
It would definitely be within a pack. So when you're obviously doing the rental, you give them the rental pack, and everything's self-explanatory from there. But obviously with tenants, we know that they don't tend to keep everything there and there, and so when there's emergency, they might have misplaced the paperwork. So it's always a good idea to have something actually on one of the doors or the walls within the property for them to then go back to and say, okay, well, the ceiling's just fallen down, right? Who do we contact? And they've got the contact number there straight away.
I hope you don't have too many of those.
No, you don't. But they do happen. Because then you've got to get hold of the. So if you have one, say you have the flat underneath and there's another flat above. Now there's another owner that now needs to know that they're the ones that are responsible for the leak coming downstairs. So then you would have to then make sure that they've contacted. So that's why it's always good to have a company to do your maintenance and management for you. Because you don't want to be too hands-on either. You don't want to be too involved with the tenants. Like the separation between yourself and the tenant, I think is always advisable. You don't want to be too, because I see a lot that sometimes when landlords tend to cut costs or save the money by paying a management agent and try and do it themselves, they'll end up getting a bit more friendlier with the actual tenant. And those tend to be the guys that have maybe one or two buy-to-let properties. They generally tend to want to do it all themselves. But then the problem is once you start getting too close and friendly with the tenant, favors start coming in and things start getting a bit tricky and messy, which then can lead to more bigger problems going forward.
Well, I think two things there. Listen, I've been looking in the development market, I suppose, for about 40 years now, and I see a lot of the pitfalls of getting too close or too distant from tenants or occupants. I mean, you're right on that.
I think distance is very good, Stephen.
To a point, yeah. But I'm just surprised that so many developers and so many fairly big agents, let's say the ones that can afford to do it, don't produce a little YouTube video or something and say, look, here's your intro to the property. Here's all our contact numbers shown on here, so you have a nice receptionist or somebody reading it out and being filmed. And there you are, just keep it on your phone. So anything that happens, you can just pop into that to see what the procedure is. And again, give them the numbers and things. I think the industry's been a bit slow in that.
Yeah, companies normally have we have an app that you can use so that you give that to the tenants, they download it, and then it's got everything on the app for them to then, navigate through. When there are emergencies, who to contact, where to contact them. Even for the owners, there's an app for them so they can see what's going on. So they don't have to be hands-on. So it's like more that you're sort of stepping away from it, but yet you can see from the app where, who's been doing what kind of work, if there's a ceiling that's been replaced, or if there's central heating that's been sorted out, or electrics work's done, that's all logged in. Okay. So most professional companies will have that option there. And that's why it's worth having them on board. because you couldn't do that.
So I suppose the only, if we talk about the insurance-backed schemes, I suppose the only slight fidget I would have if I was a landlord is that whether they'll just be a bit gung-ho about what they order and spend on repairs, and whether they were really absolutely necessary or not.
Yeah, and this is it. This is why it's always good to have transparency, and that tends to come on when you're going through what the agent's actually has done. Then you can see that, okay, they have tried to save costs, or they have tried to make it within reason, and it's not like over exaggerated.
Yeah.
It can happen sometimes, but it depends on the agent and the management company you're using.
Yeah.
What kind of builders and plumbers and electricians and etc. they have on their books. So yeah.
Okay. Zee, glad to have you here for this one. I mean, my question on that is, I presume that any costs you incur in terms of that kind of maintenance or emergency rectification bills, I presume they're directly deductible from your income, are they?
Really good question. Not really. It depends on what it is. So if it's like upgrade work, or you're doing a capital investment, then that's not tax deductible for buy-to-lets. Whereas if it's repairs and maintenance, it is. But I think one of the other key questions is how much you budget for that. What percentage are you putting in? I think I read with Bobbie, I've seen so many people do their appraisals back to the margin.
Yeah.
They don't put nothing away.
No,
You've got to put, like, I would say, just suggestion, put 10% of gross rent
absolutely
in,
tuck it away
and put it in, because you're going to need it.
You will definitely need
well,
it.
As a building does with a sinking fund for the service charge.
Yeah.
Very sensible. Okay, Zee, your question. I'm thinking of entering the world of buy-to-let and wonder if the panel could give me some advice on the key factors I should consider when I'm looking for suitable investment properties. Obviously, some of those are going to be fairly obvious, aren't they?
I think one of the biggest things is location. And the reason why I state location is there's two parts to it. And I think we were talking about this in a probably earlier episode, is around cash flow or capital appreciation, or the combination of both, and whether you're going to scale. The reason being is if you invest probably up north, they generally tend to be more cash flow driven when you do that. Whereas when you invest in the southeast of London, you tend to think about capital appreciation. And what I've seen people in the journey, they do a combination of both, because you need cash flow and you want capital appreciation. Normally people go for cash flow first, get properties that cash flow to make sure they're making money. And then when they get confident, because those properties don't tend to capital appreciate, then they invest in properties that they know they're going to have capital appreciation on track records. That's what I would be looking at, and I would suggest anyone who's investing in property to start thinking like that, and then scale accordingly.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. See, that's you've got to scale it according to what you have. So yeah, definitely.
Yes, I think so many people that sort of do half the job, don't they, thinking these things through, and always tend to look on the rosy side of life. A typical one is voids, isn't it? People very well. I've rented it for £500.
This is the killer. The void period is always the killer, because you have the turnaround time between the tenant and when you get the new tenant in, which is going to take minimum 2 to 3 weeks. So that you have to then factor in. If there's an issue with the tenant, then also you've got to factor that in. If the tenant's circumstances change and they then can't afford to pay your rent, then you have to factor, we've gone through this before, Stephen, then you have to go through the courts to do evictions, and that's not a very pleasant thing to go through, especially then when you're not receiving any rental and you're having to pay lawyers to do the eviction. So now the whole good side of the buy-to-let is gone, because you're now having to pay out in order to keep the whole thing sustainable.
And just through the normal process of human nature, the trouble is when you issue proceedings, people then say, well, I'm not going to pay my rent anyway now, we'll wait and see what the judge says.
And they've become very clever now. A lot of them, they do know, because it's common knowledge now that the courts are backed up. It's a lot harder to get a tenant out, because there's so much if the tenant just decides to counter what you're saying, the reason why you want to evict, and they just put another counter, then you just got another hearing, and then another hearing, and all this cost mounts up. So by the time you actually evict the tenant, you're looking at 18 months to 24 months even up to.
I think you've done a really good point, if I can jump in there. The savvy landlord has to really think about this. It's about the vetting. And I've actually seen landlords come and knock the next door neighbours of the previous, where they're getting a tenant, where they lived previously. And I was quite shocked, and this has been happening because people have had bad experiences. And sometimes having a bit of a bad experience is actually good for you, because you then become really diligent, and you realise, I've got to put some money aside for voids. I might not get them in the first couple of years or whatever, but if I put that money aside, it's there, because you may get not a great one come through, but do your due diligence on the tenant and make sure you get the right. You
can go 5 years, 10 years without having any issues, and then suddenly all it takes is one issue and everything crumbles.
Okay, well, there we are. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break, when we'll be talking to Bobbie and Zee again. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin, and I'm joined by Bobbie Jethwa and Zee Razaq. Welcome back. Bobbie, do the panel think that buy-to-let landlords should be the subject of greater controls and regulations by local authorities in the same way that is the case for HMO operations?
50-50 on that.
Okay, well, let's hear the arguments either way. Depending on
if you have one property and that's your only buy-to-let, then I think the regulations can, sort of hamper you a bit, because then there's more costs because you've only got the one unit. However, if you have multiple, then I think possibly HMO's sort of regulations should come in to the normal buy-to-let. But then I think there is already quite a lot of regulations already in place for buy-to-let landlords, and it is quite difficult to sort of like, before you rent out, there's so much procedures that you have to go through anyway. So I think really, I would say maybe not, they should just keep it as it is. I think HMOs are different. They definitely need to be regulated more stringently with the councils, but the single buy-to-let guys, I think they're okay where they are. I think it's not as bad. But then the thing is, it's a 50-50, because sometimes you could get the rogue landlord that's, renting out more than, putting more people inside accommodation that is not supposed to. So you got those, but they're very minority guys. Whereas generally speaking, I think there's quite a lot of the guys that are doing everything completely above board and are, and are adhering to what the regulations are. So,
see, I do just wonder, for instance, I mean, we talked in an earlier question about Inland Revenue's sort of dislike of the smaller landlord. And in my mind, I think that's about collection of taxes, really. It's very much harder to collect taxes from an individual landlord who may or may not register his tenant properly and may or may not pay the 20 or keep hold of the 25% withholding tax if they're sort of overseas or something. I mean, it's a lot easier to play about if you're on your own, isn't it? And I suppose the government are well aware of that. And I also just wonder whether local authorities have difficulty with the single landlord. If they get a complaint, if they get a problem, is that man accessible? Can I get him? Can I talk to him? Can I track him down? And in a lot of communities, that's quite difficult.
Yeah, the other example is like if you have like you're a property owner and you have an outbuilding that you've converted into like a studio flat, and that's your own, because you're making use of your space. And then you've rented that out, and that's your only buy-to-let. That's your only rental income that you're getting, and that's helping you service your mortgage for your main property. So those kind of guys, I think the regulations are fine at the moment. But again, obviously, the guys that are, buying more buy-to-lets, those guys maybe, there might be, there's more tax implications for them, of course. But again, it all depends on the type of buy-to-let investor there is, and the kind of buy-to-let there is out there.
I think I just worry generally. I mean, I think, for instance, no disrespect to yourself, but you know, as long as you can breathe, you can be an estate agent, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's the best kind of regulation we got. I mean, you know, in Spain you need a license, in France you need a license. You know,
there's no regulation as much.
And if it starts off with the agent, you just wonder how that filters down to the clients, the landlords, and everything else. And you know, we are getting a lot of publicity these days about, you know, poor quality accommodation. And in the rental market, this is going to get greater and greater as young people have difficulty buying their own home.
I sort of, if I can jump in on this, I look at it a bit different. I think the compliance is quite excessive because people don't realise when you're doing a buy-to-let, the margins are so small. If there's no incentive to make money, why are people doing it?
And
if you, either the rent goes out of the roof, which is happening already because of all the compliance that's in place, eventually it will end up that there's no property available because no one's willing to do it. And I think that's where the government, and I hope they are watching this, they got to start understanding the journey. We need landlords. We need them to invest property, and it's got to be fair for them.
Zee, go back to the late 80s when Margaret Thatcher's government brought in these assured short-hold tenancies that said, if you let your property out for the first time in history, you'll be able to get it back at the end of the term. That's what an assured short-hold tenancy was brought in for in, I think, 1988, if I remember correctly. Okay. Now what are the government doing? They're having no-fault evictions, so that surety of getting your property back, unless there are particular circumstances, have gone. So surely that's going to have a negative effect on the stock for rental, and it's going to put prices up.
There's so much red tape. I mean, at the moment, it's so difficult. I mean, is it really worth, you know, investing in a buy-to-let when you've got all these obstacles?
I have to say, I'd say no.
At the moment, it's almost impossible to do that. You're better off keeping your money in a high interest saving account, and you can sleep well at night.
I think what I'd like to see is say, if we're going towards this business of having larger corporations or commercial entities buying buy-to-let, I'd like to see a system where perhaps they build a block of flats totally for rent. They can keep them, let's say they keep them for 5 years. After 5 years, they're allowed to sell it free of any capital gain. Okay, that could be one incentive, providing they invest the proceeds back in another block further down the line. And if we could keep churning rental property that way, owned by responsible bodies, building and building and building, I think we'd end up with a stock of very good properties. But the chance of that happening, I think, are about zippo, aren't they?
On your point there is something there ready for this, because that's why you have all the capital allowances, and that's what is supposed to incentivize. Going back to the corporate, and I know time is always of essence, there should be different rules for corporates to small landlords, because they've got bigger pockets. And what I generally see, and I haven't looked at legislation in detail, is the bigger corporates have easier rules and exemptions compared to a smaller landlord. So it's not really geared for the small property investor.
No. I think it's a great shame, actually. And I also think that buy-to-let has done a great job. I know we can't put residential property into pensions, but there's no reason why your buy-to-let property can't be your pension. I mean, that's the subtle difference, isn't it? And I think it's done a wonderful job, and I think it's taken a lot of pressure off the government in terms of providing higher pensions. But right, Zee, we better get on with your question. Could the panel please give any tips on how they handle their finances as investors, and what strategies do they put in place to protect the investment's profitability?
Really good question.
Bit complex.
Yeah, it depends on how you go about it. I think we touched on before. First of all, the financing for me. Make sure you fix it to get certainty. Also look at the quality of property that you're buying. Are you going to have to invest to upgrade it? And this is the bit that people don't realise, because if you don't invest in upgrading it or making sure it's at a good condition or it's not dated, you're going to end up having a lot of maintenance. And making sure that you're having that journey right. Also having a good letting agent, so important to protect your property, so they're going regularly to see it, and you're getting proof.
Do the inspections, yeah.
Has to be done, because these days, you know, if some people are leaving and they're not, have the security doesn't cover it, you're going to end up losing a lot of money because damage can be quite expensive. So I think those are the tips I would look at, and I know Bobbie will have a lot more on those as well. But I think those 3 years, if you get those covered, you'll be in a good position.
I think you're right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when you're giving a tenant a decent property at the beginning, they'll tend to keep it in a decent way. If you give them something a little bit run down, they're not going to look after it. They're not going to put as much effort into trying to sort it out. And in fact, they'll go the other way and create more mess and more headache. And so that's why it's always good to have a property that's constantly maintained, because the more you keep on maintaining it yearly, the less cost it's going to be to yourself in the long term, because you're not letting it just run down. And then the quality of tenants you're getting in is going to be a lot nicer, and they're going to look after the property better. So I think overall, keeping it, in a good condition is the way to go.
I think one of the things there is, Bobbie, when a lot of smaller agents use these online leases, which are sort of one size fits all, as it were, and they're very lax on putting in clauses about inspections because, one, probably doesn't occur to them, but secondly, because they don't like disturbing the tenants, and the tenants don't like being disturbed during the period. But if you can catch something halfway through the tenancy, it saves huge amount of arguing.
I think quarterly is the general rule.
I think that's reasonable.
Every quarter you go there, so you're not going constantly pestering the tenant, and then you've given them, you give them advance notice within, like you can give them a month's notice in advance to say that you're coming in that quarter, and then every quarter from there. And it's also a good thing, because then you're actually getting, because they might have issues that they're not telling you about. And a lot of the tenants, they basically carry on living in the way, but there's a maintenance issue there. And because you're not aware of it and they're not saying anything, you don't really know about it. And then the problem gets even worse than what it was. So if you do the quarterly inspections, and then you can sit down with them and say, have you got any issues or any problems? Is the toilet flushing properly or not? Oh, the toilet's flushing, but sometimes it's going like this. Okay, now we know about it, so we can get something done. Whereas you keep on leaving it, and suddenly the toilet is then going into the flat downstairs. That's the gist of it, really. So you've got to keep the contact there with the tenant, and you've got to understand what the situation is.
That's all we've got time for today. So big thank you to Bobbie Jethwa, CEO of UK Property Agents, and Zee Razaq, CEO of Surtax St Albans, property industry experts. Thank you very much indeed. I'm Stephen Galpin. I'll see you next time on Property Question Time.